So I want to start my talk with a very serious question, which is, what kind of Muppet are you? Joking aside, are you more like Cookie Monster, Animal, and Ernie, who proudly nonconformist and think outside of the box, and they bring mayhem many places they go, emanating chaos? Or are you more like Sam the Eagle and Kermit the Frog and Bert, who embody order? Think about Bert, who enjoys his hobbies of collecting paper clips, is always impeccably dressed, and is always providing reality checks to Ernie, his crazy roommate. And these beloved Muppet characters reflect something powerful about human psychology, as Dahlia Whitlick at Slate noted long ago. And they reflect what I call as the difference between having a tight or a loose mindset. People who have a tight mindset notice rules around them, they have a strong desire to avoid mistakes, and they have a lot of impulse control, and they love structure and order. Others with loose predispositions don't recognize rules as much. They're more willing to take risks, perhaps more impulsive, and they're more comfortable with disorder and ambiguity. And while we can all change our tight, loose mindset quickly, think about sitting in a movie theater where your inner Bert comes out, or in a party where your inner Ernie comes out. Nevertheless, we tend to each have a default in the tight, loose mindset continuum based on our culture, gender, class, occupations, and other factors. And I want to note that this distinction of tight and loose is not new. It actually goes way back. Herodotus, the father of history, noticed it when he traveled the world 450 BC. And later, people like Ruth Benedict and Pietro Pelto, both anthropologists, started noticing it in small-scale societies and putting it on the scientific map. And more recently, I've been studying this with my team across nations, organizations, even within our own households. And it turns out that the tight-loose distinction can help explain a lot about the world. It can explain why city clocks are so much more accurate in some countries, why American dogs are so overweight, including my own beloved dog, Pepper. They can also explain what organizations need to understand about their culture, their people, their practices, their leaders when they're trying to merge with other organizations. And on a more serious note, they also help us understand why some countries suffered far more COVID cases and deaths than others. And today I'm going to give you a brief introduction to this research program, taking you on a journey to understand what is tight-loose, why does it evolve, and what consequences does it have for human groups? And even more importantly, how do we negotiate it? How do we pivot from tight to loose, or vice versa when necessary? So let me go ahead and start with just saying you can go around the world and see lots of variation in terms of how strict or permissive groups are. In Singapore, you might get fined, for example, for chewing gum or littering or not flushing the toilet in public settings. If you go over to New Zealand, you might see people walking barefoot in banks or burning couches in university settings. Other ways you see this contrast are places like Germany, where you might see people waiting patiently on the street corner, even if there's no cars around. Whereas in my home state of New York City, you see people jaywalking constantly, even with kids in tow. You might see people, for example, smoking weed in places like the Netherlands, whereas the same behavior can actually get you imprisoned in other cultures. All of these contrasts reflect something really fundamental about how strict or loose social norms are around the world. Sometimes these rules, unwritten rules for behavior, get more formalized in terms of laws and codes. But what we know is that cultures around the world vary in terms of how tight they are, how strict their rules are, and how loose they are, how much they afford permissiveness and a wider range of behavior. So I want to take you on a little journey of how we understand the cultural logic of tight and loose. And what we first did in this research program is we started to look internationally and see whether we can actually measure tight and loose across nations. All nations have tight and loose elements. But what we found is that places like Japan and Singapore and Austria tended to veer tight. Places like the US, Brazil, Spain, and the Netherlands tended to lean loose. And what we found is that tight and loose conferred a really predictable trade-off across nations. So tight cultures have a lot more order. They have more monitoring and more police per capita, and they also have lower crime. They also tend to be more uniform in what people wear and what people drive. And we found even city clocks on streets were more synchronized in tight cultures, whereas it was harder to tell what exact time it was in some loose cultures. Tight cultures that have a lot of strict rules also tend to have people who have high self-control. And this manifests in things like lower debt, lower alcoholism, and even lower weight in tight as compared to loose cultures, including pets. Loose cultures, though, while they might have more disorder, tend to corner the market on openness. They tend to have more tolerance toward a wide range of types of people. They tend to be more creative in terms of their idea generation, and they also tend to welcome change. What we found, though, is that tight and loose are not random. In fact, there's a certain logic around why tightness evolves. And what we found was that groups that have a lot of threat, whether from Mother Nature, think chronic disasters or scarcity of resources, or human nature, think how many times the country's been invaded across its time, its history, or pathogen outbreaks or density. And the logic is simple. When you have a lot of collective threat, you need stricter rules to coordinate to survive. And that's exactly what we found in this paper in Science. We found that cultures that had high population density, as far back as 1500, deprivation, territorial threat, disasters, and pathogen prevalence tended to be tighter. Now, not all tight cultures have threat, and not all loose cultures are an easy street, but it tends to be something that helps us to explain in part differences in tight-loose. This also is not just found in the modern era, and more recently, we partnered with anthropologists to analyze ethnographies across smaller scale societies in many different domains of life, like law and order, socialization, gender, marriage, and so forth. And we found very similar patterns that those groups that had more threat, density, warfare, pathogens, etc., tended to be tighter. We can also look at this at the state level. As Chris mentioned, we find in the US 50 states that the tight states have had more collective threat. This has also been replicated across the 30 plus provinces in China. And tight-loose also is not a static construct. We can partner with people outside of our discipline in psychology and try to measure change in time in tight-loose. And that's exactly what we did in a recent paper. We worked with computational linguists to analyze millions of words in Google News and books. You can see that we can create tight-loose dictionaries and see how has tight and loose been changing in the US for the last 200 years. And what you can see is that actually we become far less tight and far more loose over the last 200 years. And this change is also associated with this tight-loose trade-off of order and openness. As our culture has been in the US getting more loose, it's also associated with shifts in more creativity, but also less order, like higher debt. We can also go from books to brains and see the same trade-off in the mind. I've been partnering with neuroscientists to look at how people react in the brain when they're witnessing norm violations. So I can put an EEG cap on you and measure your neural activity when I tell you that Amanda is at a dance lesson and is at a tango lesson, she's dancing. That's normal. But what about when Amanda's at the art museum and she's dancing? What we find in this work is that when people who have very high levels of neural activity to these kind of violations have higher self-control, but lower openness and creativity on other tasks. So which is better, tight or loose? If you had to design a world, what would you want to live in, tight or loose? This is a question that's been asked across the centuries by philosophers, economists, psychologists, and we know that people like Plato and Confucius and Hobbes would vote for tightness. Hobbes had a particularly negative view of human nature, and on the flip side, people like John Stuart Mill and Freud would vote for looseness. Freud thought that rules make us neurotic. What's the answer? What do the data suggest? What we find is actually, maybe it's neither. Maybe it's the fact that groups have to veer tight or loose for good reasons. But as they get too tight and very repressive or too loose, completely chaotic and uncoordinated, that this is maladaptive. And this is what we find and call the Goldilocks principle of tight-loose. In recent research, we've found that extremely tight and extremely loose cultures have higher depression, higher suicide, higher blood pressure, and lower happiness. So the extremes are the things we have to look out for. And you can think about the Goldilocks principle all around us at different levels of analysis. So for example, we know in decision-making research that when people are given too little choice, too tight, or too much choice, too loose, they tend to really perform poorly in decision-making tasks. Likewise, think about the leaders that you've been working with over your lifetime. We know from research that leaders that provide too little discretion, they're more authoritarian and directive. At the same time, those that provide too much discretion, who are laissez-faire and providing too little direction, are also seen as adaptive and not effective. Likewise, even parenting has the same logic. We know from developmental psychology work that parents that are either overly strict, very helicopter-like, but also overly lax, tend to produce kids that are not as well adjusted. So we need to think about social norms as things that we need to actively negotiate. And this is what I talk about in terms of tight-loose balance. We need to identify contexts where we can loosen tight norms, where we need to do that, where they've gotten too tight. On the flip side, we need to be aware of contexts where we need to tighten loose norms. This is what I call tight-loose ambidexterity. And I think social norms are one of the most powerful human inventions that we have, but we also can negotiate them as needed. Let me give you two examples of ways that I think this is important. First, in the organizational context, and then in societal context. So in organizations, we know that organizations follow some of the similar logic as nations in terms of tight-loose. Tight organizational cultures have people who tend to be conscientious and careful. Their practices are emphasize standardization and efficiency. They're more formal and have a lot of training. And they tend to have leaders who are autonomous and confident. These organizations tend to evolve in contexts where there's a lot of safety threats or a lot of accountability, where rules help save lives. Loose cultures, by contrast, have people who are more open, more risk-taking, practices more flexible and experimental and informal, and their leadership tends to be very collaborative and visionary. They tend to operate in contexts where there's less threat in general. And even in the same organization, we can see variation within tight and loose. But what happens when organizations get too tight or too loose is something that we really need to be concerned with. Overly tight organizations are helicopter-like, ultra-standardized, having rules for almost everything, where people tend to be walking on eggshells. On the flip side, overly loose organizations can be very chaotic, lack any reliability and oversight, highly unpredictable and missing deadlines, and so forth. And here's where we need to really pivot and think about how do we transform these cultures to be more balanced. And we need to negotiate them by first and foremost doing a cultural assessment in terms of tight and loose. And then we can start thinking about how do we loosen tight cultures, what I call flexible tightness. How do we tighten up loose cultures, insert some structure into those systems? And I've been working with a lot of different organizations to do this. So just by way of introduction, if we want to loosen tight groups, I call it the ease model, we have some fundamental things we can start thinking about. We can examine if a rule is really necessary, allow exploration and unstructured time, and shift to a decentralized structure, encourage pushback. This helps to achieve more balance when groups are getting too tight. On the flip side, we know some organizations start getting too loose, and I call this the secure model, things that we can start to do to insert some structure into these systems. We can set clearer benchmarks, establish more structure, centralize rather than decentralize, upholding oversight and emphasizing reliability, and also enforcing more rules. Leaders, of course, are key in this process of tight-loose ambidexterity. And the devil is in the details, but you can read more about this in my book, Rule Makers, Rule Breakers. So let me shift now to COVID. This is the final thing I want to talk about, and how this construct has been relevant for what we've witnessed during this awful pandemic. Back in March of 2020, I published an op-ed in the Boston Globe getting worried about this and trying to talk about cultural tightness and looseness and the history of this construct and the idea that during times of collective threat, we need to tighten temporarily. And part of me was sounding this alarm bell, but part of me was also thinking, well, my computer simulations, a lot of our research in the laboratory suggests that people do naturally tighten under threat. But of course, that didn't happen all around the world. And actually, I've stumbled into a different literature called evolutionary mismatches coming from evolutionary biology that really are important to think about during times of threat. And the basic gist is that traits that evolve in one environment can be highly disadvantageous in a different environment. Part of this is because changes happen very rapidly. Evolution is a gradual process. And people have been applying this idea to things like obesity and drug addiction and gambling, and also to non-humans. The famous example of the dodo bird was a fearless bird in Mauritius who was very, very welcoming of humans who were a real threat, but they didn't realize it, and they wound up becoming extinct within a generation. I started wondering about, are there liabilities of looseness during collective threat? These very traits that make loose cultures very innovative and creative, can they be a liability? We started developing computational models first and foremost, and we were starting to see that actually it's true that in our models, loose cultures, the green line here, take longer to cooperate under threat. And on the right side of this graph, this is measuring aliveness rates, and they have in the computer models less survival. Then we started analyzing cases and deaths across countries. And in a paper that we published recently in the Lancet Planetary Health, we can see that in the basic correlation, that tight cultures had far few cases per capita than loose cultures. And of course, there's variability. Not all tight cultures did well, and not all loose cultures did poorly. And also there's other variables that affect cases and deaths. And in fact, what you see on this crazy screen next is just we controlling for lots of other factors to see if culture matters. And it did, even if we test control for wealth and inequality and population density and government interventions, we still find reliably that tight cultures tended to have fewer cases per capita. They also had fewer deaths per capita as compared to loose cultures. Again, this is controlling for lots of different factors. What we found that was really astonishing was that in samples that we had access to, this was 25 nations coming from YouGov data, that the percentage of people who said that they were scared of COVID varied dramatically around the world. And tight cultures had far more fear of COVID from the very beginning, from the first 100 days since a case was found in that country, but also throughout the pandemic until the later fall of 2020, loose cultures had far less fear compared to tight cultures that had only 50% of people who were scared of catching COVID. So you can think about this threat signal that's really important for tightening got hijacked in looser cultures. So I want to just end on the idea that we need to harness the power of social norms to pivot when necessary. We need to start thinking about diagnosing tight and loose in our everyday settings and think about how to be ambidextrous. I think COVID provides a lot of lessons that we've learned. First and foremost, as the last speaker said, we need clear and consistent messaging. COVID is very different than other threats, like in the United States. We tightened easily after 9/11 or other types of terrorism types of threats. But COVID is abstract, and we require really clear messaging that this is serious. And we need to remind people in loose cultures in particular that tightness is temporary. In fact, our models show that the faster we tighten, the faster we reduce the threat, and the faster we can get back to our freedom. Of course, some countries got this right. New Zealand was very ambidextrous. They were able to, in our data, they're famously loose, the Kiwis, but they were able to come together through great leadership and through people sacrificing temporarily freedom for constraint, were able to get a handle on COVID. So I will just end by saying that you can now go and take our Tight Loose Mindset quiz on the website to assess your inner Muppet. And I look forward to talking with Chris about some other questions. Please see my book if you're interested for more information.
Terrific. Thank you. Quick question on the states before we go to companies. On the states, a conundrum. You take states in the south of the U.S. that you think, that you've indexed as quite tight in culture, and yet their pandemic behavior was not what you would expect from a tight culture. In other words, complete rejection of collectivist behavior or mask wearing or something like that. Why the disconnect?
Yeah, this is such a fabulous question. And, a lot of social scientists have been really befuddled about this because decades of research have shown that conservatives, as well as people in tight states, are more sensitive to threat. But I think what we learned is that people in tighter cultures are also very sensitive to their leaders. In fact, they look very strongly to their independent, confident leaders to tell them what's important. And what we saw here is that in contexts where leaders were not very nervous about this threat, that were not concerned about it, people followed suit. So in a way, we can think about, you can follow the wrong norm, depending on who you're paying attention to. And that's what I think happened during COVID. We've tried to nudge, by the way, conservatives and liberals in the US. We had a pre-registered tournament where we really randomized 8 different nudges, from discuss types of prompts to let's do this together, to let's get back to the economy if we just wear masks. And none of them worked. Not a single one nudged anyone because there was such partisanship in this tournament. And so it's really something that we've learned is very important to see what kind of threat and who the leaders are in order to predict people's behavior.
So it seems that every single company has either been through or is in the middle of or going to go through some kind of transformation. And yet if a leader and multiple leaders, managers are trying to bring their people through a transformation, it seems essential to diagnose the way you recommend where they are. Are they loose? Are they tight? Are they a mix? Are they pocketed perhaps? Some offices loose, some offices tight. And yet I think very few companies do that. So related to that, is it more difficult to tighten a loose culture or to loosen a tight culture?
This is a great question. And I'll just mention that we have new measures of tight loose for organizations to help leaders diagnose where is the organization in terms of how strict or permissive their norms are in different domains, in terms of, for example, appearance and language and where you work, how you work. So we are able to provide a profile for where organizations are, whether it's specific units or across the whole organization. And to your second question, our research shows that actually it's much harder to change tight cultures to become looser than the reverse. There's a lot of cultural inertia when it comes to cultural change. So we really need to introduce changes in tight cultures in terms of gradual changes, not big changes. We need to get buy-in from people, and we need to be aware that it's going to take longer to go from tight to loose than from loose to tight.
And in doing so, will leaders have more success with a loose culture by saying, as you suggested, I think, hey, the tightening is temporary. We're not going to make an authoritarian rule here, but we're going through a very tough transformation. And so we need to act differently temporarily.
I think that's exactly where I would put the money, that, people really get concerned. You need to think about the underlying threats that people face during these changes. For people in loose groups, they're worried about autonomy. Tight groups are worried about control. So we need to deal with those underlying needs. And we need to help get buy-in in loose cultural groups. It has to be very bottom up to help people understand, why is this change necessary? What can it afford us? I think we need to understand that both tight and loose are essential to any system. We want to try to have both. We want to try to maximize order and openness in our systems, and we can do it. We can do it at the organizational level, the national level. And so I'm optimistic that, we can pivot when we understand this cultural code.
Hey, I lived in Singapore for 5 years, and I have to correct just one thing on your sign there. It's no longer illegal to chew gum. It's illegal to deal. Right. You can chew, but you can't deal. Yeah. But that's right. Singapore made me very... Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, it's really about bringing in large quantities of gum into the country. That's really a problem. And, right. Americans or other people look at this and say, that's ridiculous. Why can't you bring gum? And when you think about Singapore, it's very highly densely populated. It has over 20,000 people per square mile. And, when you have that many people per square mile, gum tends to cause a lot of problems. And that's what happened in Singapore. People were chewing the gum and putting it all over the place. It was causing problems. And Lee Kuan Yew, who's a good cultural psychologist, as far as I'm concerned, said, hey, guys, we're going to have to ban this tasty treat. I'm sorry, this is really causing too many problems. And so it has a certain logic. You can use gum for medicinal purposes and so forth, but you can't just bring in a whole bunch of gum to the country. So understanding this can make us a little more empathic.
Last quick question in about 30 seconds. So imagine you want to bring more innovation and creativity to your company, but you find that your company culture is more tight than loose. What can you do about it?
Well, I think, we need to understand that, these norms have been put in place for a long time. The kind of people we've attracted to the organization have tighter mindsets. People we've retained have tighter mindsets, and the practices and the leaders there have all been aligned to make tightness important and useful. So we need to start thinking about all those different levels, the people that we're bringing in, the practices, the leadership. And as I mentioned, we have certain recommendations on how you can, sort of ease that structure to be more loose through gradual changes. But we need to make sure that, we understand that this system is going to take a little while to pivot.
Dr. Michele Gelfand, thanks so much for spending time with us. You've given us so much to work on and think about. We really appreciate you joining Nudgestock. Thank you.